have a story to tell. Pat Diver, he wasn't scared of much. You see, he'd been traveling these roads for years, going from town to town. But you know, tonight the wind was kicking up, icy cold, and he hadn't yet found a place to stay, and it was getting dark. You see, Pat Diver was a tinker. He could mend a pot or a kettle in the wink of an eye. But no one wanted their pots mended tonight in exchange for a night's lodging. Go away, they would say, even when he offered them some coins. Well, Pat wandered on and wandered on. He soon wrapped his jacket around him tighter and trudged on. He found himself on a long, quiet road, and in the distance he could see an old farmhouse. Well, he stepped up his walk and he headed for that farmhouse. And when he got there, he peered in the window and he saw an elderly couple. So he knocked on the door. Surely they would let him stay. And the old man answered the door. And immediately, Pat begged him to let him stay. The man looked at his wife and she nodded. "Well," said the man, "you can stay if you tell us a story." Pat looked at him and he looked at the old woman and he said, "I haven't got a story to tell. I have no stories." And the woman answered him, "Not even one story?" Pat just shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. "Well, off then," said the man, and he just slammed the door as fast as he could. So fast, in fact, that Pat fell over backwards and nearly fell on the ground. Well, Pat was so tired. He wasn't going anywhere. As tired as he was, and as cold as he was, and angry besides, because he had never met anybody as rude as this. He noticed there was a rickety old barn behind the house, and he headed straight for it. And inside, he saw a pile of straw in the corner. "Any bed'll do," he muttered to himself, and he headed for that straw. He burrowed his way in, and he laid down in it, and he covered himself just enough so that he couldn't be seen. And soon he was fast asleep. Later on that night, he was awakened by voices somewhere else in the barn. And he saw these two big, husky, burly men whose faces were hidden by long, greasy, stringy hair. Soon they started lighting a fire in the middle of the barn. And after the fire was going strong, they dragged something in from outside in the shadows. It was a dead body. They took a rope and they tied it around the body's feet. And they took the other end and they swung it up over the beams up high in the barn. And they pulled the rope until the body was hanging just above the fire. And then one of the men began turning the body around and around over the fire, turning it as if he was roasting it. Pat Diver was terrified. He was shivering. He was trying so hard not to let his teeth chatter. Well, soon the man who was turning the body said to the other, "I'm tired of turning this body. You take a turn." And the other man answered him, "Not me. Let Pat Diver do it." And with that, he kicked the straw and he reached in and he grabbed Pat Diver by the scruff of his neck and he pulled him up to standing. Now Pat Diver was shaking in his boots, but he walked over to that fire. And one of the men said to him, "You turn that fire good, but you make sure you don't burn that body." And he laughed. And the other man said, "We're leaving now, but we'll be back." And the two of them just left the barn into the darkness. Well, Pat turned that body as if he was a seasoned chef. He made sure nothing happened to it. Soon the flames began to rise, and they rose up over the body. And in fact, they caught fire on the rope. And soon the rope burnt right through, and that body fell down right into the fire and began to burn. There were ashes and flames flying everywhere. And Pat Diver, he flew out the door. And he ran as fast as his legs would take him. He wanted to put as much distance as he could between him and those awful men. He ran so fast that after a while he thought his legs couldn't take him any farther. And when he thought he couldn't run anymore, he just kept on going. And finally, out of breath, he dove into a ditch and hid behind some overgrown weeds. And as he was finally catching his breath, he heard heavy footsteps approaching him. And then he heard harsh voices. And then he saw the two husky men, the same men from the barn, and they were carrying that burnt body. Well, he was terrified, but he stayed hidden behind the weeds. One of the men said, "I'm tired of carrying this body. You take a turn." And the other man said, "Not me. Let Pat Diver do it." And with that, he dove into the ditch and grabbed Pat Diver and stood him up on the ground. And they lowered that dead body, all burnt and charred, on the shoulders of Pat Diver. Now Pat Diver was already clammy and shivering, but now with that charred body around his shoulders, he felt like he was going to throw up. "It's your fault," said one of the men. "You burned it, and now we've got to bury it." "Move it," said the other man. And with that, the three of them started walking down the road. They walked mile after mile until they finally arrived at an old, decrepit, deserted graveyard and a dilapidated, abandoned church. In the distance, they could hear owls calling and hooting back and forth at each other. Bats were flying above their heads. One of the men started clearing away weeds, and the other took a shovel and began digging a grave. Pat Diver took this opportunity to quietly let his heavy burden drop to the ground. He thought about sneaking away. So he went over to this big hawthorn tree and he climbed up in it and he hid high up in the branches, not making a sound. After a while, the man who was digging said, "I'm tired of digging this grave. You take a turn." And the other man answered, "Not me. Let Pat Diver dig." And with that, he went over to that hawthorn tree and shook it so hard that Pat came tumbling down to the ground. He didn't need any more encouraging. He stood up on his own. He knew he had no choice. He didn't know what those men would do to him. And at this point, he almost didn't care. He walked over to that shovel and he began digging as if his life depended on it, because it probably did. And he dug and he dug until he had blisters all over his hands, and he lost all track of time. But you know, those two men, they were watching for the sunrise. And when they heard the first rooster crow, they decided to leave. And they told Pat Diver to keep on digging. One man said, "Pat Diver, this is your lucky night. Because if we could stay any longer, we'd bury you with that dead body." And then they left. "My lucky night?" said Pat to himself. "This has been the most horrific night of my life." When he finished digging the grave, he rolled the dead body into it, and he covered it with the loose dirt. And when he was all finished, tears were streaming down his face, and he wiped them away with his dirty, gritty hands. He barely kept himself from sobbing out loud. And with that, he began carefully walking down the road. Now, for months and months, Pat couldn't mend anything. He was shaky and terrified. His hands shook so much he couldn't do much of anything. But after a while, Pat was able to resume the tinker's trade. But he made sure that he always found a place to stay long before nightfall. But one day, storm clouds rolled in, and it began to rain and pour heavily, and the sky grew darker very early that day. And Pat knew he had to find a place right away. So he began walking quickly, and he found himself on this lonely patch of road, and he saw ahead of him an old farmhouse, and he headed straight to it as fast as he could. He knocked on the door, and an old man answered. Now that man, he looked vaguely familiar, but Pat couldn't remember where he'd known him from. The man called him in at once and gave him a seat by the fire. His wife called out the window to her two sons. "Come on in, boys," she said. And Pat was horrified when the two men got in the door. These two big, husky, burly men, whose faces were covered by long, stringy, greasy hair. Their mother said, "Come here and listen, boys. Pat Diver's got a story to tell."